This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock again here, getting back into the history of the great American fortunes by Gustavus Myers, this long-forgotten, muckraking journalist who, unlike just about every other historian you're likely to read today, actually told you the ugly, sordid truth about the history of your godless nation. Again, this is the history of the great American fortunes. And this is Chapter 4 of Volume 4. This came out around 1908, 1909, something like that. Very early 20th century. These muckraking journalists, they proliferated at that period because they saw the final nails being put into the coffin of whatever paltry liberties this country ever had, we the little people. I guess we actually had some liberties in practical terms. We did, if not in actual legal terms, because the Constitution was always a fraud. Trust me on that, or email me if you want confirmation. But they saw it all going by the wayside, these muckraking journalists, and they tried to rally. They tried to raise the alarm. They saw the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Fords and the Astors and the Goulds as they monopolized every industry of this country and did everything the Old Testament warned against and outlawed in the Mosaic Code. But it happened. It happened, and we're slaves today as a result of it. Slaves to these giant mega corporations and these dynastic families that are now our overlords. The Vanderbilts. People like that. Okay, Chapter 4, Volume 4, Gustavus Myers, The History of the Great American Fortunes. The present status of the Gould fortune. What was the concrete result, the grand culmination of Gould's 15 years of plundering? He himself gave a demonstration when, on March 13th, 1882, he called in Russell Sage and other associates and exhibited to them a box crammed with securities. Disparaging reports had been scattered in Wall Street that he had been hit hard by recent declines in the stock market, and it was to belie these statements that he summoned in witnesses to attest by impressive proofs that his wealth and power were unaffected. He spread out $23 million of Western Union stock, $12 million of Missouri Pacific stock, and $19 million of other stocks. Observed Sage, quote, "There is not another man in America, except Vanderbilt, who could make such a display of stock as that," unquote. But the securities thus revealed were only a part of Gould's wealth. They did not include many other varieties. 2 years later, he ostentatiously made another and still larger display. Those heaps of stocks and bonds were the legal tokens of this one man's far-reaching power. By their ownership, he was vested not only with the mastery of the great inflowing revenues from numerous corporations, but the autocratic control over a vast army of wage workers. Every dollar of his fortune had been extracted by deceit, bribery, fraud, there's that word again, and theft. Yet here he was, one of the dominating magnates of the country, the owner of a ramification of properties, the dictator of the fate of tens of thousands of working men, exactly what the Mosaic Code of the Old Testament would have prevented and did prevent in ancient Israel. Behind him, as an impregnable fortification, stood the law, with a capital L, guaranteeing him the possession of that which he had seized by theft. Warred on capitalist and worker alike. But a few years back, and Gould was buying law to escape law. And now, here he was unbranded with the prison stigma, thanks to his money, and lording it over the nation. But ever there clung to him that same crass, indiscriminate brutality of method in dealing both with the powerful and the weak. Just as he struck hard at competing capitalists without timidity or mercy, so did he openly and candidly browbeat and terrorize his legions of working men. Of him it could not be said that he shrank from assailing the strong while overawing the feeble. He warred on both capitalist and on labor, organized and unorganized, and did so with equal ferocity, whether by involution or frontal onslaught. Gould was not the politic sort of magnate who cut the pay of his working men, and then, as a solace, presented them with a toy philanthropy. He did not polish greed with hypocrisy. When he reduced the pay of the workers on his lines, he did it with a bold aggressiveness, daring them to challenge his power. Few magnates, while in the very process of putting through some colossal fraud, had the hardihood to incite the resentment of their employees and of the people. They preferred to wait until the agitation over their individual frauds had been tempered by a certain lapse of time. Such a cautious policy on no occasion hindered Gould. During the very times when he was defrauding and bribing, he belligerently attacked his workers and compelled them to accept lower wages. What if a public outcry should go up? He had been menaced with many outbursts of fierce, withal futile, public indignation. They had not interfered with his accumulations. He viewed them with a cynical scorn. In 1881, he and his clique were loaded down with spoils. The people had grown exceedingly restless, stung by their poverty on the one hand, and contemplating the gigantic wealth of the capitalists on the other. Gould went ahead as if public protests were as nothing. He added, as we have seen, $13 million of watered stock to the capital of the elevated railroads in New York City, and at the same time forced the agents and the gatemen on those roads to submit to new terms. They had been complaining that they had to work from 12 to 15 hours a day for their wretched pittance of $2 and $1.75 a day. Gould listened to their grievances and conciliated them with an order reducing their day's work to 12 hours. But their visions of scanty triumph vanished when they learned that he had also cut their pay. At the very time that he was looting the railroads in the West, he reduced the wages of the men on the Missouri Pacific and defied the labor unions, causing great strikes in 1885 and 1886, by which, however, his railroad workers gained virtually nothing. Most typical of the servility of many newspapers and politicians were the abuse and obloquy with which the labor leaders who conducted those strikes were overwhelmed. Let a man champion the cause of the oppressed, and no matter how lofty his ideals or noble his nature, he was at once subjected to an endless stream of ridicule and traducing. The servitors of the public press and the retainers of politics joined in a vicious persecution. Martin Irons, who managed the Missouri Pacific strike, was defamed, hounded, and blacklisted. It was pitiful to see this man, one of the purest, best, and self-sacrificing, precariously compelled in after years to sell peanuts for a living, and he now lies in an obscure grave, quite forgotten, while the remains of Gould, one of the master thieves of the period, repose in a spacious mausoleum. See you on Judgment Day, buddy. And the children of Gould are among the oligarchy of families ruling the United States. Never will you hear such a truism from a history book you might pick up in Barnes & Noble or Borders books. The oligarchy of families ruling the United States. Gustavus Myers. Thank you for calling it, telling it like it is, was, and always will be in this fallen existence until Jesus Christ returns. Theft rewarded with power and splendor. At 45 years of age, Gould possessed more than $100 million. He was prematurely old. His beard was streaked with gray, his hair thin, and his swarthy, bilious, glowering face was rigid with hard, deep lines. His form had shrunk so that he looked more insignificant than ever before. But when he traveled, no one could mistake the evidences of sovereign power. From one end of the country to the other, he rode in a palatial private car, handsomely appointed, containing every comfort and luxury then devised. An observation room, a parlor, a dining hall, sleeping rooms, a kitchen, and porter's quarters. His yacht, Atalanta, was sumptuous indeed. His manner of life befitted that of a full-blown magnate. At Irvington-on-the-Hudson, he sequestered himself in a great and costly mansion, surrounded by 500 acres. Attached to it was one of the finest conservatories in the world. His city residence in New York City was a massive, somber brownstone house at the northeast corner of Fifth Avenue and 47th Street, in the very heart of the aristocratic section. He, however, had other mighty powers not evidenced in outward display. For some years he owned a newspaper, the New York quote-unquote World. A curious sight it was to see one of the great pirates, who many a time had narrowly escaped prison, instructing the public as to its duty, moral, political, and otherwise. But the known fact that Gould owned this newspaper helped to discount its utterances and reduce its circulation. A much more successful and insidious method of influencing public opinion was by his control of the Western Union Telegraph Company and, through that corporation, of the Associated Press, the foremost news distributing agency in the United States. You hear that, folks? The Associated Press, where your Fox News and all the other CNN and New York Times and LA Times, they get so many of their stories from the choke points like the Associated Press. Gustavus Myers lets you know here, the Associated Press was bought and sold over a century ago. Long, like way beyond over a century ago. And you're trusting this still? Distorted, misleading, or false news dispatches were manufactured or artfully colored and supplied to the public press. These not only gave Gould superior underhand facilities for influencing the course of the stock market, but they were also used in favor of capitalists and against labor and radical movements at every opportunity. The public was fed on grossly perverted news accounts of strikes and labor and political movements. Upon this fabricated news, the newspaper owners, themselves capitalists or largely servile to capital, based hostile, if not malevolent, editorials. And the combination of the whole was used to prejudice the mass of the public against any movement or agitation threatening the complete sway of capital. My people perish. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And the love of money is the root of all evil. Jay Gould's death. Jay Gould's last years were divided between the tortures of severe indigestion and insomnia. Up and down the block fronting his New York City mansion, he would nervously pace for hours during the long, shadowy vigils of the night. How did Gustavus Myers get all this inside information, I'm wondering? This is amazing, fascinating. A little shrunken, cankered man, vainly endeavoring to tire his mind and frame into an exhaustion-compelling sleep. He died on the morning of December 2nd, 1892, and his body was interred in a classic mausoleum costing $110,000 in Woodlawn Cemetery. Many multimillionaires whose ways and station were akin to Gould's, and some of whose careers were interwoven with his, showed up at the funeral services. Russell Sage was there, and J. Pierpont Morgan, and Collins P. Huntington, and a group of others. An impressive procession of money lords with appropriate visages and attired in the immaculate garb of mourning. although not a soul really mourned Gould save his own family. His will disclosed an estate of nominally $77 million. But this was merely the exoteric side of the testamentary document. The estate amounted to far more. All was bequeathed in trust for his 6 children, 4 sons and 2 daughters. Unlike the Astors and some other magnates, Gould did not transmit the bulk of his wealth to his oldest son. Now, when Jay Gould died, many newspaper-owning scavengers who, during his lifetime, had bootlicked him or kept fearfully silent, belched forth vituperation and rehearsed his odious deeds. Their misrepresentations consisted not in exaggerating his evil, that were not possible, but in singling him out as an exceptional defrauder, and in detaching him from the system which produced him, and which alone could be held responsible. Gould passed away the most hated man in the United States. Social ambitions had never concerned him, but his children developed the yearning for recognition. At every step, at first, there came an outrush of the old taunt that their father's fortune had come from pillage and wrecking. Yet all of the founders of the fortunes were, without a single exception, of the same stripe. All had tricked, lied, deceived, bribed, defrauded, and stolen. With hundreds of millions of dollars, however, at their command, the Goulds were able to overcome all social obstacles. When one has money enough, an elect social position does not have to be accorded. It can be taken by assault. One of the easiest routes is by buying an entree into the caste of European titled nobility, which in these business days does a lively trade huckstering names for cash. Accordingly, in 1895, Anna Gould, one of Jay's daughters, was transformed into the Countess de Castellane, and the Count received the opportunity of requisitioning many of the Gould's millions. During the next 11 years, he right jovially availed himself of it, and squandered millions with a fine prodigality, and went through fantastic antics until a divorce cruelly put a stop to them. But Mademoiselle Gould ascended still higher in the pages of the Almanach de Gotha. The Count's successor is the Prince de Sagan, a perceptive scion who is doing his valuable part in demonstrating how the feudal nobles, often deprived of their stolen estates at home by revolution and dissipation, can leisurely recoup by allying themselves with estates stolen in newer countries. Wow. The struggle for survival. To lay too much stress upon the social aspirations and doings of the Gould family would obscure the titanic industrial conflict in which they have been engaged. After Jay Gould's death, the wealth and possessions of the family greatly increased, and its conquests were extended. But this process has not been allowed to continue unrestricted. The last few years, as we have already pointed out, have ushered in a terrific contest for the exclusive mastery of the nation's resources. Looking back 50 years, we see a large number of petty, consequential industrial bosses, each running his own little railroad or factory. A change then takes place. Great, energetic capitalists develop, who make war upon the petty bosses, and by fair means or foul, crush them, seize their properties, and consolidate these into great systems. The petty railroad owners disappear, and their places are taken by such overbearing magnates as the Vanderbilts, the Goulds, Huntingtons, Morgans, Hills, and the like. 10 years ago, all of these men were magnates of colossal power, each heading some great system and despotically dictating over some particular domain. Now, another stage in the process of industrial evolution is being reached, which signifies the decline of overlords of the Gould type, and which foretells the approaching climax of capitalist institutions. Mighty as these magnates have been, they are gradually and inexorably being subordinated by a still mightier power, the most puissant of all. The aim of this all-pervading power is industrial absolutism. And in the pursuance of this inevitable end, it is grinding down all opposition, even as the Goulds, the Vanderbilts, and others have squelched lesser magnates heretofore. No longer are the Goulds able to extend their power much. The climacteric period has arrived when they have to fight hard to retain what they have. The rising autocracy. This supreme power, clutching at every form of the production and distribution of products, here it comes, folks. We're at last to the point in the book where it gets beyond interesting. This supreme power is the Standard Oil Company, headed by the Rockefellers. The final nail in the coffin. The final and ultimate mountebank, snake oil salesman, dynastic family, to put an end once and for all to any form of, any facade of liberties we ever had. Standard Oil Company, headed by the Rockefellers. 35 years ago, it obtained a monopoly of oil products by getting secret railroad rates and by other crushing methods. At first, it ingratiatingly approached the railroad magnates as a supplicant seeking favors. Soon, as a matter of policy, it made these magnates sharers in its profits. Then it began to buy its way into the ownership of railroads. Its profits have been so fabulously vast that it has been under the constant, unescapable necessity of reinvesting its vast surplus, ever growing vaster. This surplus it has applied to buying up railroads, banks, mines, public utilities, and industrial stocks and securities of all descriptions. With this fixed, unchanging policy, its power grew to such an extent that its members began to push themselves in as directors of a great variety of corporations. For a period, it then carried on a policy of having, quote, a community of interest, unquote, with the large magnates in every field, of working in cooperation with them in determining industrial matters. But during all of this time, it was encroachingly buying more and more stocks of all kinds, so that now it has arrived at the point where, operating through such generals as the lately departed Harriman, it is gradually forcing the Vanderbilts, the Goulds, and other first-rate magnates of a decade ago to a secondary place, and entrenching itself in autocratic authority. Several of the railroads long ruled over by the Goulds have become, to a considerable extent, Standard Oil adjuncts. Industrial battles, such as that between George Gould and the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1902, will, as occurrences, soon be extinct. This warfare arose over Gould's project to extend the Wabash Railroad to the Atlantic seaboard. The Pennsylvania Railroad promptly objected to a competitor in its richly profitable territory. The ensuing struggle was fought out in legislatures, common councils, courts, Congress, and by actual physical force. So completely have the Pennsylvania Railroad magnates ruled that state for 50 years that it did require considerable temerity on Gould's part to war upon them. One of the most marked instances showing the extremes that the Pennsylvania Railroad magnates went in their rule was the Riot Indemnity Bill, which they attempted in 1879 to get the legislature of that state to pass. It is advisable to present a sketch of the circumstances of this bill, inasmuch as it gives a good idea of the methods of A.J. Cassett, long the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. It was Cassett whom George Gould had to fight in 1902. The methods Cassett used in 1879 were the methods he invariably used. With all his unscrupulousness, Jay Gould never had the face to do anything approaching in enormity the Riot Indemnity Bill of Cassett. Yet when Cassett died recently, the most lavish eulogies were everywhere published. He passed away in the full attributes of superior respectability. All right, we're going to take a break for a couple of minutes, and I'll see you on the other side. All right, we're back. Continuing on with Chapter 4, of Volume 4 of the History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. Self-inflicted arson and a $4 million grab. We have seen in an earlier chapter how the Pennsylvania Railroad's officials, during the Great Strike of 1877, ordered their agents to set a number of worthless freight cars at Pittsburgh on fire in order to charge the strikes with being riotous. We call those false flag operations nowadays, folks. And so far, the only novelist who predicted that is still George Orwell. And so have a pretext for calling out the military, of course. That very crime of arson, these magnates, 2 years later, made the basis for an attempt at plundering the people out of $4 million at one grab. In the whole industrial history of the country, no avowedly bolder scheme had ever been tried before. When, in 1879, a bill was introduced in the Pennsylvania legislature to indemnify the railroad to the amount of about $4 million for the loss of property, the news was received with general amazement. Cassett pushed the bill, and it would have become law had not some of the legislators revolted at the brazenness of the plan. A few denounced it as a monstrous fraud. One, in particular, Representative Wolfe, charged that bribery was being used and demanded an investigation, whereupon a committee of investigation was appointed on April 9th, 1879. Another one of those, huh? The report of this committee specifically... We keep hearing about these committees. That's every time, and all they ever do is let the heat out of the kitchen, and that's it. Nothing ever happens. Nothing ever stops the crime from happening again. The report of this committee specifically stated that 3 members of the legislature had been guilty of bribery. From the evidence, it was clear that Cassett and Quay, the latter a corrupt politician at the head of the Pennsylvania Republican machine, had both leagued forces to rush the bill through. That many of the members had been bribed either with money or with promises that certain bills of theirs would be passed. That corrupt combinations existed among members to pass important legislation, and that many editors of influence throughout the state had been bought to advocate the passage of the bill. A war of multimillionaires. Such were the ways of Cassett, the head of the forces that George Gould had to encounter. Of all results, Gould sought most to get an entrance into Pittsburgh with its stupendous annual traffic of 75 million tons. The government of that city was owned by the Pennsylvania Railroad. But what of it? If money could put in and run one set of officials, money could also put in another set. So George Gould decided, and rightly so. The government of Pittsburgh now became the stake. Gould adroitly caused the question of the entry of the Wabash Railroad to be made an issue of the municipal election of 1902. Backed by his millions, so it was said, a quote-unquote reform movement. You're remember that scene from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? We got to get us some of that reform. Oh, with the incumbent candidate and the guy with the midget and the broom. Classic. A quote-unquote reform movement was generated and blown into lusty growth. Gould carried his point. A common council favorable to his plans was elected. At the same time, Gould had a bill passed by Congress allowing him to bridge the Monongahela River. The statement has been made that it cost him $12 million to get an entrance into Pittsburgh, but the documentary proof is wanting. After spending $35 million, he carried through his Wabash plans. Now, the warfare of force began. In retaliation for Gould's victory, the Pennsylvania Railroad magnates ordered all of his Western Union telegraph poles along that railway's right-of-way to be cut down. If the telegraph operators had gone on a strike, the cry would have been raised that they were dangerously interrupting an essential public business. Interesting. Just like what happened to the air traffic controllers during the Reagan administration. But violence, when committed by magnates, was held a sacred right of property. And no protests of government officials were heard. I'll bet they weren't. This transaction has been only one of many of those corporations controlled largely or partially by the present generation of Goulds. In a work being published serially at the time of this present writing, 1910, and written by Judge Ben B. Lindsay, a public-spirited jurist who has the most intimate knowledge of Colorado affairs, Judge Lindsay reveals in detail some extent of the corruption in that state. He tells how nearly all of the officials and judges are corporation tools, how vast numbers of fraudulent vote scam over a century ago. Here we go. Vast numbers of fraudulent votes are counted at elections. Gee, really? And how the corporations have dictated the election or appointment of many of the very judges whose decisions have been so oppressive to the working class. In particular, he tells at length how Governor Peabody was fraudulently declared elected in 1905, and how Peabody had bargained to appoint to Supreme Court judgeships certain men named by the corporations. Lindsay goes on, quote, "Does this seem incredible? Read then the Colorado Supreme Court Reports, Volume 35, page 325 and thereabouts. You will find it charged that the Colorado and Southern Railway Company, the Denver and Rio Grande Railway Company, and the Public Service Corporations of Denver had an agreement with Governor Peabody whereby these corporations were to be allowed to select the judges to be appointed to the Supreme Bench. You will find it charged that Luther M. Goddard had been selected as a proper judge by the Public Utility Corporations, but that the two railroad companies objected to him as, quote, too closely allied with the interests of the Denver City Tramway Company and the Denver Union Water Company, unquote. The statement continues, quote, As a last resort, the agent and the representative of the said Colorado and Southern Railway Company was induced to, and did, after midnight on Sunday, the 8th day of January, and at about 1 o'clock in the morning on Monday, the 9th day of January, repair to the home of the said Luther M. Goddard in a carriage, calling him out of bed, having then and there such conversation with the said Goddard, that the said railway corporations, through their agents, withdrew their opposition to his confirmation, and they did, on said morning, at about 3 o'clock thereof, announce to the remainder of the said corporations, through their said agents and representatives, that their opposition had been withdrawn. And the withdrawal of the said opposition having been announced, the said Senate of the 15th General Assembly did, almost immediately upon its convening on the morning of Monday, the 9th day of January, confirm the said nomination of the said Goddard. Unquote. The brief containing these charges is signed by Henry M. Teller, ex-cabinet member and United States Senator, and by ex-Governor Thomas, acting as counsel for Senator T. M. Patterson, who had made the charges in his paper, the Rocky Mountain News. These gentlemen offered to prove the charges before the court, but the court, in a most amazing decision, refused the offer, held that no matter how true such charges might be, it was, quote-unquote, contempt of court to make them, and fined Senator Patterson $1,000, unquote. Wow, what levels of fraud make up the true history of this nation, this hypocritical nation. And so it seems, if such charges as these are true, that the present Goulds are continuing the methods of their father. It may also be well assumed that these public revelations are only indications of extensive underground practices and transactions, many of which are never publicly disclosed, slowly sliding downward, as it is, to a relinquishing place in the ranks of wealth when compared to such fortunes and power as Rockefeller's. The Gould family is, nevertheless, prodigiously rich. 40 years ago, Jay Gould was doing his best to keep out of prison. Today, his children and grandchildren live in gorgeous palaces. Georgian Court at Lakewood, New Jersey, one of the homes of George Gould, is emblematic of their splendor. Built in the Georgian style of architecture, the main part is 200 feet long and 50 wide. The great main hall is 30 feet wide and 50 feet long. At one end is a massive elliptical staircase of marble and bronze, supported by marble columns, and at the other end a superb marble fireplace. Around 3 sides of the hall is a mural painting 16 feet high and 80 feet long, a depiction of the Canterbury Pilgrims from Chaucer. 150 pendants of cut glass radiate prisms from the chandelier. The furniture in this hall is of Louis XIV style, blazing with powdered gold and covered with deep crimson velvet. This palace contains 30 rooms for the use of George Gould's family and guests. The very bedstead in which George Gould sleeps cost $25,000. And all around this gray and white mansion, gray stucco covering brick walls, are fairy-like sunken Italian gardens filled with statuary and magnificent fountains. Connected with the mansion is a court built at a cost of $250,000, wherein is a great tan-bark hippodrome, a gymnasium, bowling alleys, and lounging rooms, a shooting gallery, a large swimming pool, and Turkish and Russian baths. And this is only one of the many palaces of the members of the Gould family. Whence all of this wealth and splendor came is now an open book. No enigma are its sources, but a prolonged tale of fraud and theft, whereof the most vital facts only have been herein brought out. Wow. What an indictment. Okay. This is Real History, and it's been Chapter 4 of Volume 4 of the History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. I'm Gordon Comstock. This has been the Ministry of Truth. Over and out.